Over spring break, I was able to go on a mission trip with students here from Duke. We also had students from NC State, and we went to the area of Cancun, Mexico. And so I think there were a lot of people from Duke going, but not all of us were going on a mission trip. And something that was special about the mission trip is that it had this aspect of service. We were helping to build a school, but there was also an aspect of pilgrimage. And we were able to visit the shrine of Our Lady Undoer of Knots there in Cancun. And this shrine came about in the year 2015. One of the local priests decided to build this. And, it's following this devotion that Pope Francis has made a lot more popular in the church since his becoming Pope. And even over at the Fa, where we have this little shrine of Our Lady Undoer of Knots. And one thing that stood out to me, it's a really a beautiful space, and there's a lot of, kind of different little nooks and crannies you can explore. And it's kind of in the middle of a forest or a jungle, you could almost say. And so you have these little chapels, and you have kind of these tunnels that are formed by the ribbons that represent the prayers that people have brought to the place. But where we ended up having Mass was this little chapel that had air conditioning, which we're very grateful for. But there, the sign, kind of in the entrance to the chapel, it invited the pilgrims to take off their shoes, because you're entering upon holy ground. And so a lot of our missionaries, well, they did precisely that, and outside there were these little places to leave your shoes, and you could do that personally. I kept my shoes on. But it was this idea of entering into holy ground, and that comes out very strong in the first reading today. And I've always been fascinated by this encounter between Moses and God in the image of the burning bush, and it's something that's fantastic, that's amazing. Imagine seeing this bush that's burning, that you see the flames, but that nevertheless it's not being consumed. And we have to think about, where is Moses at this point in his life, that he's having this tremendous encounter with God. He's already gone through a lot. We could even just think about the story of the birth of Moses, that he's born in this time where the Pharaoh has ordered all of the males of the Hebrews to be killed. And, Moses' family is a little bit clever and able to hide him and, kind of sneak him down the river, and he's rescued by, one of the women in Pharaoh's court. So he grows up as if he were Egyptian, and he's kind of caught between these two worlds. So he's growing up in Pharaoh's court, and he has all of the traditions of the Egyptians, and he's been given the rights. He's basically a prince of Egypt. But then at the same time, he has this feeling that he doesn't really belong there. And he's kind of almost like looking across at the Hebrews, who he knows, this is my people. And so this conflict, this contrast within Moses is something that grows to the point that, he even strikes one of the Egyptians in order to defend the Hebrews. And he ends up, fleeing because he's afraid of being captured, of being taken prisoner. And so all of a sudden he goes out into the desert. So this young man who had grown up kind of with all the privileges possible of the time, all of a sudden he's out in the desert and trying to once again find his identity. One of the kind of constant themes in the life of Moses. And he goes out, and at one point he finds this burning bush. And this is one of the critical moments in the life of Moses. And then what does he have to do? What's this invitation, probably in the voice of an angel? Remove your sandals, for you are stepping on holy ground. And I think that this is a moment that's hard for us, especially as Americans, to understand, because we tend to not hold anything sacred, right? We just kind of expect, or we have a very horizontal view of the world oftentimes, and so it's difficult to understand or to recognize that which is sacred. And I think that it's perhaps something that our Lord is inviting us to now during Lent, to recover, to regain that sense of the sacred, because I think it affects us in so many aspects of our lives if we don't recognize that there's something different. We can even just ask ourselves how we come into this space. As we're celebrating Mass, this becomes a sacred space. But it's easy to just kind of stumble in, it's one more activity on our Sunday, or we can really recognize it as a sacred space, as a place where we're encountering God. Now, I'm not saying we have to leave our shoes outside the door, but it is helpful to renew our faith, to activate our faith as we come here to worship. And so I think that we can look for holy ground in our own lives, and I would begin precisely with Sunday Mass. I remember a talk that I heard as I was beginning my own path of formation for the priesthood, and the priest was inviting us to have greater faith. And one of the things he said, when you grab the handle of the chapel door, activate your faith and realize I'm coming into the presence of God. And I think that's the biggest thing, and that's kind of this aspect of entering upon holy ground, of being aware there's something different. You can walk through Duke Chapel, and it's a beautiful testimony of faith, right? We have these high ceilings, and we have this kind of Gothic architecture, but there's something different when you walk into Memorial Chapel, and you see that little red lamp, and that means Jesus is here in a very special way, in the presence of the Eucharist. And as well, when we come for adoration here on Sunday Mass, so we have the Blessed Sacrament reserved in the tabernacle here in Goodson, or walk into the Father. But wherever we enter into a church, and we know that Christ is truly sacramentally present there, we're entering upon holy ground. And that has to affect the way that we're experiencing it. And so even something has to change in us, so that we're able to recognize that encounter with the Lord that we're called to. And even when we enter into Mass, even our language is different. We don't start Mass just saying hello to each other, how are you doing? The Lord be with you and with your spirit. So even the language that we're using is different, and it reflects that sacredness that we come to experience and to inhabit. We could think of this holy ground as well in our own personal prayer. Hopefully when we have that time for prayer, it is a sacred space as well. One of my favorite passages from Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II, is in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, where he's talking about moral theology. But when he describes the conscience, he talks about that inner space in man's heart where he's alone with God. And that's something that's beautiful. Now, we don't want to fall into subjectivism with that. That's not what he's talking about. But it is a very special place of encounter with God. And that's what we should be experiencing when we enter into prayer. And sometimes it can even be helpful to call to mind these images from the Bible. And for me, the image of the burning bush is one of the most powerful. And where Moses goes there, and perhaps, I'm sure that Moses didn't know all of the Hebrew traditions, and he didn't know perhaps how to be a proper Hebrew in his worship of the living God. And nevertheless, it was the living God who went to meet Moses, and who then gave him that call, that vocation, that mission that would mark the entire rest of his life. And so let's be open to that as well in our own moments of personal prayer, to let our Lord encounter us, to let him challenge us, to let him, knock our socks off almost, make us take off our sandals so we can enter into that holy ground with him. And then finally, I think we can find that holy ground in our service to others. I know personally, I feel very privileged as a priest, being able to talk to so many people in individual conversations, either spiritual direction or some type of a moral consultation. And I have to say, I always feel like it's something that's very special, almost like a doctor, scrubbing up before an important surgery. There's a certain respect there. This is somebody that I'm called to help, but this is somebody that I'm called to respect, and that there's this relationship between God and this individual, and I'm allowed to kind of peek into that, but I have to always respect that primary relationship that this person has with Christ. Pope Francis reflects how the heart of each young person is an example of holy ground. Each young person's heart should thus be considered holy ground, a bearer of seeds of divine life, before which we must take off our shoes in order to draw near and enter more deeply into the mystery. So my invitation for all of you this Sunday is to reflect, where do I find holy ground in my own life? Perhaps in my prayer, my living of Sunday Mass, in the way that I serve others, but that we have a little bit more consciousness, a little bit of more awareness. And even when we're coming to Sunday Mass, it's like, what am I doing differently in this moment? This isn't coming to listen to a lecture. This isn't simply a cultural experience. This is an encounter with God. We look at this encounter between Moses and God in the burning bush. We talk about it as a theophany, a manifestation of God. And that's what we experience as well each time that we come together and celebrate the Eucharist. So let's grow in our own understanding, our own awareness, and see how can we give better expression to that in the way that we live out this celebration of the Eucharist, in the way that we come before God and we ask him to show himself to us.